Hello, welcome to Workshop Wednesday. Today I want to talk about harmony, and I'm going to go really kind of fundamentals. So if you have a musicology doctorate, you probably don't need this, but it might be a good refresher. So the basically. What I want to do is just take you through the very basics. Now, here's a C scale of C, like do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. And you can think of those as numbers. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And the basic unit of harmony is an interval. An interval being the space between two notes. So for example, if I play a C and I play an E along with it, that interval, 1, 2, 3, that interval is a third, which is really a fundamental one. If I keep going, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, a C and a G together are a fifth. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If I do all the way up, go up to the octave, that's counting up to 8. That's an octave. Now, those notes, the root, the C, the third, the fifth, and the octave, are all there in the C chord, in your cowboy C chord. And those cowboys knew a lot more about music than they let on, I think. So there's your C major chord. Now, thing to be aware of right now is that there are two kinds of thirds. There's a major third, there's a minor third. But we're not going to deal with minors right now. I'm just going to deal with major. The arrangement of notes within a chord is known as the voicing. So if I do, for example, instead of playing a C chord like this, if I play it like this, let's say, and stick the G on top, put the fifth on top, that's a different voicing from this. It's still the same chord, but a different voicing. Now, if you change the bottom note of the chord to a different chord tone, then that's called an inversion. And it's very easy to get inversions and voicings mixed up. But an inversion is when you actually invert the nature of the chord. So for example, here's the C, but here's a C in the first inversion with the E, with the third in the bass. So I've just got, the E on the fourth string, open G string, and the tonic, the root, on top. Now I could put that in an entirely different place. Let's say I could do it like this. Actually, hit like this. That's with an E here on the 7th fret of the 5th string, and the G and the C on the 8th fret of the 2nd and 1st string, and then the middle C on the 5th fret of the 4th string. So one thing you want to get used to, if you can, is being able to count up the string as well as just in low positions, but actually start to get some familiarity with what's going on up the neck. So just to recap that, in a major chord, the root, in this case a C, the third, the fifth, and the octave. Now, in classical harmony, like I mentioned, the third can be major or minor. Let's take an A minor chord. See, there's an A, which is the root, and there's the C, which is the minor third, as opposed to C sharp, which is the major third. strong difference. And you can trace this back actually to, I mean, this goes back to Pythagoras. And there's, like, here's an open string. You divide it in two just by touching the harmonic at the 12th fret. And that gives you the octave. There's an E. There's an octave E. Same note as if you pick it, as you stop it, fret it. But I'm just touching the string. If I go to the 7th fret, there's the 5th. 5th fret, that's the next octave. So root, 1st harmonic, 2nd harmonic, 3rd harmonic, 4th harmonic is the major third. Slightly out of tune with the way that it would actually come up. Played on the guitar, you might hear it. Hear that beating a little bit, like a vibrato. That's because a natural major third is not tempered the same way as the way the guitar is fretted. But we don't need to go deep into that. You keep going, there's another 5th. Now you start to get into some of the really upper partials. The minor third is somewhere way, way up there, because the minor third is not as consonant as the major third, which is, I think, the reason why it sounds sad. In fact, D minor, the saddest of all keys. And as a result, we kind of start with major because that just is the way that nature provides it. So a C chord, an A chord, D major, G major, all of our recognizable cowboy chords. But intervals can be used in different ways. I mean, the power chord, for example, is just the root, the 5th, and the octave. So let me grab a pick here. So if I'm and the reason really for doing power chords that way without the third is, first of all, you want to put a third in an E major chord, you're going to be in trouble because you can't get the root because the third down there. And if you're doing like big full chords, especially with, I haven't got a distortion patched in here, but once you get into distortion, you really are at that point dealing with a lot of intermodulation between the harmonies, and it doesn't come out clean. Maybe on certain pickups it will, but in general it doesn't. So the power chord, the power chord is neither major nor minor. It is neutral because there's no third in it. You add the third, or there's a big difference in the quality of a major versus a minor. But we counted up to 8. Let me count from the G. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So there's the scale of G. But you can keep going. So you can go 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. You're up at the next octave. And one of the more useful intervals is actually the interval of a tenth. But we'll get there in a bit. First of all, let's just look at the third again with the C and the E. If you flip those and you put the C on top, so let me count from there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's a sixth. And the same thing, let me go from an A to an F sharp. Or a B to a G, or now the tricky thing is that a third inverted, and that's what you do when you turn it upside down, you're inverting it. So C to E now becomes E to C. A third inverted becomes a sixth. So if you add the 2, you get to 9, which is just a reference. It doesn't mean a great deal. But if you take a fifth, so here's a C to a G, and you invert that, so you put the C on top, now you have a fourth. 1, 2, 3, 4. So a fifth inverted becomes a fourth. A third inverted becomes a sixth. And like thirds being major or minor, also sixths can be major or minor. And a major third inverted becomes a minor sixth. So not only do you flip the numbers, but you also flip the quality of it. Because if you think about it, here's E to C, but here's E to C sharp. See, that's your major, and that's part of the just the regular major chord. So in fact, when you look inside of a major chord, here's a C chord. If I put the E on top, then I've got a G and an E right there, which is the minor sixth. Now, there's a couple of questions there from Alexander. The sus chord is indeed, it's a suspension, and we'll talk about suspensions momentarily. You're not hearing a major or a minor third. You're suspending that. So I'll talk about that in a moment. But Terence, a D7 chord is not an inversion of a D chord. A D7th chord is actually an addition to the chord. And here's, let's say, for example, here's your D chord. Now, there are two kinds of sevenths. There are major sevenths and minor sevenths. If I replace the D in the middle of that chord with the major seventh, still a root position chord. It hasn't been inverted at all. I'm not doing something like putting an F sharp, putting the third in the bass or anything. It's strictly still a root position chord, but it's a D chord with the major seventh. So we refer to that as D major 7. If I make it the regular D7, that's what we call D7. But interestingly, the seventh there is minor, because you go, here's the D, there's the major seventh of the scale. So in the D major scale, the seventh is a C sharp. I make that C a C natural, which is not in the scale. It actually belongs in the scale of G, which is why a D7 chord will resolve to a G chord. Again, we'll talk about chord progressions momentarily, but I just want to kind of talk about intervals a bit more. So the root, now you do a second, a C and a D. Clearly that has some dissonance to it. It doesn't feel resolved in any way. And you can, for example, suspend the third. So here's C, G, C, D, G. And that's a C2 or a C sus2. Now a C add 2 will be a little different, because if you add the note, what you've got there is a regular C chord, but you're adding the D, which you could look at it as the 2, or you could look at it as the 9 too. So you could call that C add 9, which is not the same as C9. I know it gets a little confusing. So let's bring it back. The standard chord now, a C7 with the minor 7, not with the major 7. C major 7, C7. We don't refer to it on top of a major chord. We always refer to it just as the 7th. You add the 9th on top of that. So you've got C, E, so root, third, minor sevenths, D is the ninths. You could stick a G on top too. But the fifth of the chord is kind of a color. It doesn't necessarily change the basic nature of the chord. So you can play a C chord without a G and it still sounds like a C chord. You play a C chord without an E, and now it just has that kind of open fifth sound. Sounds almost medieval, because medieval music harmony didn't use a lot of thirds. And you keep going. If you want to go beyond that, and let's call it a C13. So root, third, minor sevenths, ninth, 13th. Or I could revoice that a little differently. So there's the root, the minor sevenths, the ninth, the third, and the 13th. And there's no real difference between a sixth and a 13th. Play that as a C6 chord. It's just really how you count it. And if there's a ninth underneath it, you kind of just keep going. Now, just to finish up that set of information, fourths, the fourth, you can't have a minor fourth, because if you go one below the fourth of the scale, you're just down at the third. But you can have an augmented fourth. Fourths and fifths, if you sharpen them, they're augmented. So here's, for example, an augmented fourth, which is a very dissonant sound. Let me put it on an F to a B. So 1, 2, 3, 4. But what's cool about that is you stick a G underneath it, and you have a G7 chord. You stick a C underneath it, move it down a fret, you have a C7 chord. Because the secret there is that the augmented fourth is symmetrical. That an F to a B and a B to an F is the same. So if you invert that, an augmented fourth is simply an augmented fourth. Remember I said that if you add them up, they come to 9. Well, 4.5 and 4.5 is 9. That's the only interval that you can do that with. Now the fifth, on the other hand, can be, if you sharpen it, it's augmented. So let's say, for example, here's an A chord, here's an A augmented. You can call it A augmented fifth, but typically if it says A augmented, it's an augmented fifth. So you add a seventh to that. How about putting it up here? So the first chord of Oh Darling, augmented seventh. Now the fifth, on the other hand, if you lower it a half step, yes, those of you that are paying attention will notice that you lower an F, a G to an F sharp over the C, and it's the same as an augmented fourth. But there are times when that fifth is referred to as diminished. And we'll get to that as we progress into the other step, the last step of a seventh. Let's go back to the D. D. Ooh, I'm playing something. Look at that. You know, that descending from the tonic to the minor seventh to the minor seventh. I'm sorry, the tonic to the major seventh to the minor seventh. But you can go one more with the seventh. And you can actually go to a diminished seventh. So, let's say, for example, I have a chord. Here's a D chord. Put the D there. I'm going to have the D diminished seventh in there. So there's a diminished seventh. I'm going to make it a minor chord by putting an F in there. So F is the minor third of a D. And then I'm also going to add the diminished fifth, because the regular fifth of a D would be an A, so I make that an A flat. And I have what we commonly refer to as a diminished chord, or a diminished seventh chord, which is indicated by that little circle. So you'll see like D with a little circle next to it, as opposed to D augmented, which would have a plus sign. And the thing about a diminished chord, diminished seventh chord, call it either way, is that it's actually stacked minor thirds. That, let's say you've got F, you've got A flat, you've got B natural, actually I'll finger it this way, F, A flat, B natural, and D. Which is why you can move those up and down the neck, if you want to score some silent movies there. So the seconds can be minor, but you typically don't really like a minor second off of a, let's say a C chord, a C note, would give you a pretty dissonant sound. It only really makes sense, let's say if you've got a C7, make that the seventh, and then add that flattened second, which is the same as a flattened ninth. And that does make sense, because a C7 flat 9 is a very commonly used chord. Okay, so seconds can be flattened or major, so minor or major. Thirds can be minor or major. Fourths can be perfect. Fourths are perfect or augmented. Fifths are perfect, diminished, or augmented. Sixths are typically just sixths, because if you go down, you've got the augmented fifth. If you go up, you've got the minor seventh. So a sixth pretty much is what it is. And then the seventh is either major, minor, or diminished. And then octaves, we'll stick with just the octave being perfect right now. Now, if you don't go to the, let's say on the D chord, you don't go to the third, in here is the F sharp, but you use the suspension. Let's say I play an A9, an A7 chord. Again, I'm just sticking with cowboy voicings here. That G would then normally resolve to the third of the D chord. But if I don't resolve it, and now I resolve it, so that's a suspension resolving. So it's what, like you might indicate it on a chord chart as a 4, like a D4 or a D sus4, and then go into a D. Sometimes just for shorthand, I'll do 4 dash and then to 3. Or you could suspend the 2. Let's say here's an A chord. So of course you've got, one of those things. There are certain kinds of just purely guitaristic approaches, and that's one of them, where it's just the mechanics of being on the fingerboard very much lend themselves to that kind of movement. But there is a musical underpinning to it. There's a theoretical underpinning. Alexander says, is descending fifths a classical style? Well, in strict classical harmony, you don't do parallel fifths. I mean, it just because it kind of, if you think about it, I mean, even more medieval sounding. The only person who really gets away with stuff like that is Beethoven. Kind of from Beethoven onwards, it became, I think, a bit looser. But Beethoven, because of Beethoven's almost kind of metal heavy metal, but for an orchestra at times. So you wouldn't typically descend in fifths unless you know. So you can do it in rock and roll, but in anytime you want to really maintain the integrity of the voice leading, you would unlikely do that unless it was a special effect. Okay, now I mentioned tenths earlier. Let's go from the G. There's the 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. See, that's Paul. What Paul McCartney discovered was that if you do parallel tenths, that's very harmonious. I mean, and really what it is it's parallel thirds, but just divided by an octave. And Paul got it from Bach, anyway, from the Bach Bourrée. Especially this section. You can hear that's where he got the idea. Now, of course, in typical Beatle fashion, it was regurgitated, as it were, in a very natural way, because the Beatles were very adept at taking their influences and then turning them into something of their own. Okay, so let's see. Alexander's asking about melodic minor. I'll get there in a bit. I'm not quite ready because the melodic minor, the minor keys get more complicated. And before I get there, I want to talk about. Wait a minute. Taylor asks, have I got a lot of open string ideas for harmony from Tony McManus? Well, I think that's what we do. I mean, as fingerstyle players, you really, especially using altered tunings, and especially like, for example, in DAGGAD tuning, I mean, it's just where we go. Tony and I have, on occasion, had dinner on the road and, swigged back a few scotches. But really, it's not. I mean, I have my own explorations in that area. So, because my background, I have a degree in music, so this is stuff that I've really been kind of studying and putting into practice for a very long time. But Tony's a great player, and the master of what I call the McManus, that kind of like those little tremolo things that he does. Love his playing. Okay, so we've talked about what happens vertically, but now I want to talk about what happens horizontally. And the most fundamental unit of harmonic progression, or chord progressions, chord sequencing, whatever you want to call it, is the cadence. The cadence being the musical equivalent of a period at the end of a sentence, for example. So here's a G chord, here's a C chord. Now, the G being the fifth of the scale, we call that the dominant, because if you play a G chord, your ear wants to hear you resolve it to a C. Or if you play an A chord, resolving to a D, an E chord resolving to an A B resolving to an E. That's just kind of a fundamental. And again, it goes back to the harmonic series. That these are just kind of very natural relationships, sonic relationships. And of course, if you add a seventh, typically the seventh is going to want to resolve, an E7 is going to resolve to an A. Now, not always in rock and roll. I mean, in rock and roll you can sit on the seventh. In jazz you can sit on the seventh. But in cowboy harmony and in strict classical harmony, a seventh is usually an indication that you're going to resolve it to a third. So the 5-1, and if you are familiar at all with the Nashville number system, where they use numbers instead of chord names. So, for example, you might see on the chart it might say 5-1, and depending on what key you're in, because if you're working with singers who might want to change key, rather than have to transpose from what's written, in Nashville they use numbers. So 5-1 would be in the key of C. It would be the 5 chord, which is the G, resolving to the C chord, the 1. Or in the key of E, it might be the B, the 5 would be the B resolving to the E. That's known as a perfect cadence. Now the other significant cadence is the plagal cadence, which is the 4-1. So it's that kind of amen cadence where not as propulsive, not the dominant cadence, the perfect cadence is very much, here's the 5, resolved to the 1. The plagal cadence is a much softer resolution. And has its own purpose, and you certainly get it in a lot of church music. Whereas the dominant, the 5-1 cadence, is really kind of like the stuff, especially like Baroque music. You think about Vivaldi or going into classical music. The 5-1 is a lot of progressions are just built around the 5-1 chord sequence. Now, I'd mentioned in a previous workshop, I mentioned the cycle of fifths. And what the cycle of fifths is it extends that relationship. So, for example, here's E, which is the 5 chord to A. A is the 5 chord to D. D is the 5 chord to G. G is the 5 chord to C. C is the 5 to F. F is the 5 to B flat. B flat is 5 to E flat. E flat is 5 to A flat. A flat is 5 to D flat, which is 5 to F sharp or G flat, which is 5 to B, which is 5 to E. And so you've gone around in a whole circle. And where this comes into play in practical purposes is you don't always have to make, in a cycle of fifths progression, you don't always have to make each chord a major chord. So for example, I could go A minor, G to C. And that's a cycle of fifths progression, but it's not all dominant tonic. And when we talk about 2-5-1, it's like D minor 7 to G or G7 to C. So that's 2-5-1 in the key of C. And that happens so often, especially in the Great American Songbook, where you really are, everything is kind of built around this kind of journey through the 5 chord back to the 1 chord. And you have certain tunes, like All the Things You Are. Is built entirely around cycle of fifths in the verses, where I've got a F minor, B flat minor, E flat 7, A flat major 7, D flat major 7 to G7 to C. And then it continues C minor, F minor, B flat. Actually, I've got a B flat 9 there. E flat major 7, A flat, D7. It's a little tricky. I know, there's like many flats and things there. But before I go any further with that, just be aware, a D minor 7 chord or an E minor 7, that's an E minor chord with the minor 7th, as opposed to, let's say, an E minor chord with the major 7th. Add the 9th to that, and you got your James Bond chord, your 007th chord. So remember that it's, 7ths, and then major 7ths, and then 007ths. All right. Taylor's asking about George Russell's Lydian concept. I have not checked out his book, but when you're talking about Lydian concepts, now we're talking about modes. And the Lydian mode is the mode that's based, like, the modes have Greek names. If you take take the notes of a C scale, for example, if you start on the D, that's the Dorian mode. If you start on the F, that's the Lydian mode. And what's weird about that is you get that augmented fourth because you've got the F and the B natural. So, there's kind of advanced jazz concepts that involve what's called quartal harmony, like harmony based on fourths. Miles Davis was using that kind of thing. And that's beyond where we're going to go today. I mean, I'm really trying to just get your brains wrapped around the more basic concepts. So in chord progressions, I mean, let's say we've got now I'm voicing a D minor 7 like this, where I've got the D here on the 5th string, 5th fret, and then I've got a G7, but I'm adding the E to it, for example. But that's 2-5-1. Now you can do substitutions. You can substitute, for example, instead of me going, let's say, E minor 7, A augmented, D minor 7, G, which is a pure cycle of fifths progression. I could do so instead of doing the A7 augmented, I'm actually just moving the E minor 7 down a half step. So it's just, and this happens a lot in jazz harmony. Let's see. Hang on. Those kind of, I'm in the mood for love. Somebody's asking about Lydia the Tattooed Lady. Isn't that a Harold Arlen song? I think it's a Harold Arlen song. No, I am familiar with Tak Andrus, Taylor. And I mean, what I'm talking about is, this is the basis of jazz harmony. It's really, at the end of the day, it's just how you apply it, how you integrate the guitaristic aspect of it into the kind of the meta information, which is substantially, it's set. I mean, the cycle of fifths is always going to be the cycle of fifths. I mean, yeah, once you get into John Coltrane territory, you can then find kind of all kinds of weird nodal connections between the different things. One thing I do want to point out, if you look at the diagram of the cycle of fifths, because the F sharp in the key of C, because the F sharp divides the octave, that you look at the cycle of fifths chart, and the F sharp is opposite the C. And what that provides you with is kind of a little bit of a Ruby Slippers kind of thing, where you can, there's a way of clicking your heels and getting into a completely different key center. And you see that, for example, with all the things you are. Now, there's a D flat. The augmented fourth away from a D flat is a G. There's a G7. So now I've changed keys, and I'm in the key of C, at least momentarily. The weird thing about this song is you never really know what key you're in until you're almost at the end of it. But it starts on F minor. And then it does the same thing again. C, so it goes from the C major, C minor, F major, minor, B flat, E flat, A flat, and then the augmented fourth away from A flat is a D7. Now I'm in the key of G. Remember, I started on F minor. Now I'm staying in G. Now I'm going to just do an abrupt key change to E. And now I'm going back to F minor. Now it sounds like I've changed key, which I functionally have, but really I'm back to where I started. Finally, I get the home key, which is A flat. And then just to be tricky. Now, you'll notice, as I started launching into that I'm not necessarily going to play full chords. And this is really an important thing to absorb, is that, when you learn, when you first start and you learn these cowboy chords, and the whole idea of learning chord shapes is something that goes back hundreds of years. I mean, in the Baroque era, in the 17th century, the Italians came up with something called Alphabeto, which is a system where you have a diagram that shows you the shape of the chords. And then each one of those diagrams has either a figure associated with it or a letter. So, for example, the letter A is a G chord. I know it's totally like counterintuitive. Letter A is a G, letter B is a C, letter C is a D. And I think the reason for that is because in the Renaissance, the four-course Renaissance guitar was tuned up to an A. So think of it like a ukulele. So the C shape, once the tuning dropped down from the A down to the top string being an E, that shape continued to be the primary shape. And if you think about it, if you're learning guitar for the first time and you want to be able to play 1, 4, and 5 in the key of G, you're sure better off, especially also because G is a more vocal-friendly key, than being in C and having to learn that F chord. And the fact is that the only reason we think of C as being kind of like a starting point is because on the keyboard it's all white keys. It's kind of a vanilla. It's a vanilla key, but in fact, guitaristically, G was kind of the first thing that you would typically learn, at least historically. So what's important with this is that you learn these shapes, and when you're playing bluegrass, for example, I mean, when you want to kind of a lot of noise coming out, especially on a dreadnought, which this is about 1 million miles away from, then playing the full chords is one thing. But in jazz harmony, you don't play complete chords. I mean, I could do just playing a G7 like this. Freddie Green with Count Basie would play sometimes just one note, not even the full chord. But you could do it just with an F and a B, especially if there's a bass player. See, G, C7, 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 G7, walking down, A7, D7, and they're just playing in sixths. No, sorry, tenths rather. Oh, one I didn't point out, which is clearly we should know that you play an E7 and you stick a G on top. So you stick the sharp 9 on top. Then you're into, Now look, there's your augmented fourth. I mean, Jimmy used it, in Purple Haze. But it's just E and B, E and B, B flat, sorry, E and B flat. And then go into the E7 sharp 9, Sgt. Pepper. That E7 sharp 9, So it was funny because, Paul got the idea of that chord from Jimmy, and then Jimmy turns around and opens his show 2 days after the release of the Sgt. Pepper album, opens his show at the Savile Theatre with Paul and Eric Clapton and I think George in the audience, playing Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. So, they were basically trading guitar licks. So yeah, these walking blues kind of... A7, and there A7, B minor 7, C diminished, A over C sharp. Now, what I haven't talked about really is the inversions where you, for example, where you put the third in the bass. So, for example, here's a G chord. Instead of playing the G in the bass, let's see. What I'm doing there is I'm putting the third in the bass. And then I'm just moving that down. Oh, there you go. There's a D7 with the flattened fifth in the bass. D7 flat 5. Very commonly used chord. Like in bossa novas and stuff, where you would put the seventh in the flat fifth in the bass. Now, what's interesting about that chord, here's a D7. There's no fifth in that. I've just got root, third, minor seventh, and the octave. That if I put that in there, that flat 5, because it's based around the tritone, that augmented fourth or flattened fifth, that chord could either be a D7 flat 5, or it could be, and you go a tritone away from D, which is A flat, it could be an A flat 7 flat 5. So here's A flat 7, here's A flat 7 flat 5, which resolves, so actually like a cycle of fifths progression. D, so there's another example. Here's A minor 7, actually A minor 7 add 4. A, G, C, D, and then D7 flat 5 to G6 or G major 7. All right, so this could go, I could go on for hours, but I actually have to get to a studio in about 20 minutes. So any last questions before I start to wrap it up? But I owe Bunny something. She wanted to know the beginning, what chord voices I'm using on the beginning of I Can't Give You Anything But Love. And what I'm doing there, because the natural thing will be just to do it off of a regular C chord, because the melody C, B, A is just right there. But because I'm looking for a particular sound, that it's a C, and then my first finger is playing the E and the A. You can't, let's move those, Django-fy those fingers for a second. And now, if I want to get the C on top, see, there's a C chord. Hang on, Daniel, and I'll tell you. So what I'm doing, the melody, C, B, A, so, and then I'm going to E minor, A minor, and then a D minor over an F. Hang on, not thinking straight. I'm too busy reading here. But that's the thing, is it's a C6, and that way I can do the kind of the Travis thing, like that. All right. Daniel wants to know what the next workshop will be on. I don't know. I've been thinking about doing a little guitarology and going into the history of the guitar. But you want to come up with ideas, I'm open to it, because for me this is just throwing some ideas out there, just giving you the benefit of my experience on this stuff. And I will be back on Facebook on Monday for my regular Moody Monday session. Nothing this Friday. I'm playing at a wedding. So that's things are starting to open up, and as things start to open up, I'm kind of less available for doing this kind of thing. I was doing Facebook 3 times a week, gradually cutting things down. But this, I kind of like doing this YouTube thing on Wednesdays, so I'm going to try and keep this going. And I'm sorry if I get a little too ahead of my skis sometimes with this, because it's just, I have a lot of information, and it's hard to kind of rein myself in. It's one of the reasons why I don't do a lot of kind of systematic, kind of progressive teaching, only because my brain kind of wants me to, just keep going with this stuff. So, but I did think that it was worthwhile to do something like this. Now, Eric's asking about a workshop topic. How do I keep such good time? Well, you mean I'm having a good time, or I've been a studio musician for a very long time, and a lot of studio work involves wearing headphones and playing to a click. So I've had a lot of practice playing with a metronome. But if you want to get into the rhythm side of things, go to truefire.com and sign up for my rhythm guitar class, because I've got a course on rhythm guitar. I think it's called the Rhythm Method or something. And I think that you can gain a lot from that, because it really kind of breaks it down into how, sticking with the patterns. But I have to say, I mean, I have had the benefit of playing with some of the greatest drummers ever, and that's a revelation, because nobody puts the beat in exactly the same place. So, but learning how to internalize that has been an important part for me, especially many, many years of playing solo. Doesn't mean I don't speed up on, if I get too excited, but it's I think that really worthwhile to practice with metronome, so that you really kind of start to internalize that beat. So before I pack it up, just a little bit more about changing the inversions, so that you've got the first inversion with the third in the bass. So here's your D chord. Instead of that F sharp being on top, you just stick it at the bottom, which of course gives you the one step up to the tonic, E7, A7, for example. F sharp to, there you go. So and like from a C to a G over a B. If you go back I did a workshop on arranging a few weeks ago, and I talk a little bit about, we go into Amazing Grace, and I talk about using those first inversions, to create a moving bass line. So instead of going C, G, A minor, you go, use the B on the bass, and then you've created a bass line because you're walking down. All right, I'm going to have to run. Duty calls. But thanks for tuning in. And you can email me, ljnews@lawrencestuber.com. And make sure you check my concert page on my website, because things are starting to develop. I will see those of you that are into Facebook. I will see you there on Monday, same time, 1:30 Pacific, for a Moody Monday session. So, all right then. Well, cheers. And by the way, any Wings fans out there, if you didn't catch it yet, go to alerttheglobe.com and look for Rock Show, the show we did the other night with the Tribe Band of Musicians, a whole set of Wings. So that was a lot of fun. All right. Take care of yourselves. Cheers.